I learned to cry silently when I was 7 years old, not because I wanted to, but because the sound of my tears made my father's fists harder and my mother's words sharper. In our house in Billings, Montana, silence wasn't golden. It was survival. The floorboards creaked under my small feet as I tiptoed through the hallway, praying that neither Joseph nor my mother would notice me. But invisibility, I discovered, was just another kind of prison. The bruises on my arms told stories I wasn't allowed to speak, and the fear in my chest grew heavier with each passing day. I was Lauren, the daughter who learned that love came with conditions I could never meet. The morning light filtered through our dirty kitchen window, casting long shadows across the linoleum floor where I sat eating stale cereal. My father, Joseph, sat across from me, his bloodshot eyes scanning the newspaper while his coffee grew cold. Every movement he made sent shivers down my spine, even when he was calm. Yesterday's beating still echoed in my ribs, a dull ache that reminded me of my latest failure, spilling juice on his work papers. My mother stood at the sink, her back turned to us both, washing the same plate over and over again. She never looked at me during breakfast anymore, not since I'd stopped being the perfect daughter she dreamed of having. "You're breathing too loud," Joseph muttered without looking up from his paper. My chest tightened as I tried to make myself smaller, quieter, more invisible. The spoon trembled in my hand as I lifted it to my mouth, the metal clinking softly against my teeth. Even that small sound felt too loud in the suffocating silence of our kitchen. My mother's shoulders tensed at the sink, and I knew she was holding her breath too, waiting to see if this moment would explode into another storm. We all walked on eggshells in this house, but somehow I was always the one who stepped wrong. School was my only escape, though I carried the weight of home with me like a heavy backpack I couldn't remove. Mrs. Patterson, my 4th grade teacher, had kind eyes that seemed to see too much. I kept my sleeves pulled down and my head low, hoping she wouldn't notice the finger-shaped bruises that decorated my arms like ugly jewelry. The other kids laughed and played during recess while I sat alone, reading books that transported me to worlds where children were cherished and protected. In those stories, parents tucked their children into bed with kisses instead of threats. I wondered what that kind of love felt like, but I was too afraid to imagine it completely. The walk home from school felt like a death march, each step bringing me closer to the house that held my nightmares. Our neighbors probably thought we were a normal family. Joseph worked at the railroad, my mother kept house, and I was just a quiet kid who minded her own business. They couldn't see the terror that lived behind our front door, or the way my stomach twisted into knots every time I heard Joseph's truck pull into the driveway. The sound of his boots on the porch steps was like thunder before a storm, and I learned to read the weather in his footsteps. Heavy and slow meant he'd been drinking. Quick and sharp meant he was angry about work. Either way, I knew to disappear. That afternoon, I made the mistake of leaving my backpack on the couch instead of taking it straight to my room. Joseph's voice boomed through the house like a cannon, calling my name with a tone that made my blood freeze. My mother appeared in the doorway, her face pale and resigned, already knowing what was coming. "Stop crying, you deserve worse," she would say later, after Joseph's belt had left fresh marks across my back. "At least we feed you." Those words cut deeper than any physical pain because they came from the woman who was supposed to protect me. Instead, she stood by and watched, sometimes even holding the door closed so the neighbors wouldn't hear. The bathroom mirror showed me a stranger, a girl with hollow eyes and bruises that bloomed like dark flowers across her skin. I traced the marks with my fingertips, wondering if other kids had parents who hurt them or if I was uniquely broken. The face staring back at me looked older than 10 years old, aged by secrets and silence that no child should carry. I practiced smiling in the mirror, trying to perfect the mask I wore at school. The smile never reached my eyes, but it was enough to fool most people. Most people didn't want to see the truth anyway. It was too uncomfortable, too complicated, too real. Sleep never came easily in our house. I lay in my narrow bed, listening to the sounds that drifted through the thin walls. Joseph's angry muttering, my mother's quiet sobs, the crash of something breaking in the kitchen. My pillow was damp with tears I couldn't hold back in the darkness, tears that I swallowed before dawn broke and the performance began again. Tomorrow would bring another day of walking on eggshells, another day of pretending everything was normal, another day of being the invisible daughter who learned that love was supposed to hurt. But somewhere deep inside my chest, a tiny spark of hope flickered, waiting for someone to notice that I was drowning in plain sight. Monday morning arrived with the familiar dread that settled in my stomach like a stone. I pulled on my long-sleeved shirt, carefully arranging the fabric to hide the fresh bruises that painted my arms in shades of purple and yellow. The mirror reflected a girl who had mastered the art of concealment, but I could still see the fear lurking behind my practiced smile. Joseph had been particularly angry over the weekend because I'd accidentally knocked over his beer while reaching for the salt at dinner. The memory of his belt whistling through the air still made me flinch, even now in the safety of my small bedroom. My mother had watched from the kitchen doorway, her arms crossed, her face expressionless as she counted each strike like she was keeping score. Mrs. Patterson greeted our class with her usual warmth, but I kept my head down as I slipped into my seat near the back of the room. She had a way of looking at students that made me feel like she could see straight through to my soul, and that terrified me more than Joseph's anger. During reading time, I lost myself in a story about a girl who lived in a lighthouse, safe and surrounded by light. The protagonist had parents who worried when she was late for dinner, who bandaged her scraped knees with gentle hands and soft words. I closed the book quickly when tears threatened to spill onto the pages, because crying at school would only make things worse at home. Art class was usually my favorite, but today my hands shook as I tried to hold the paintbrush steady. We were supposed to paint our families, and I stared at the blank paper for what felt like hours. How do you paint a family that exists in shadows and silence? How do you capture the weight of fear in watercolors? I finally painted a house with no people in it, just empty windows that looked like sad eyes staring out at nothing. Mrs. Patterson stopped beside my desk, her presence both comforting and terrifying. "That's a very interesting perspective, Lauren," she said softly. "Would you like to tell me about your painting?" I shook my head quickly, my throat closing around words I could never speak. Lunchtime in the cafeteria was a symphony of normal childhood sounds: laughter, chatter, the clink of spoons against lunch trays. I sat alone at the end of a long table, picking at the sandwich my mother had made with stale bread and processed meat. The other kids talked about weekend adventures, sleepovers, and family trips to the park. Their words felt like they were spoken in a foreign language, describing a world I could observe but never enter. Sarah Martinez, who sat 2 seats away, complained loudly about her mother making her clean her room. I wanted to tell her how lucky she was to have a mother who cared enough to ask her to clean anything, but the words stayed trapped inside my chest. The afternoon brought math class, and I struggled to focus on the numbers dancing across the blackboard. My ribs ached where Joseph had kicked me yesterday, and every breath felt like a reminder of my worthlessness. Mrs. Patterson called on me to solve a problem, and I stood slowly, my sleeve riding up slightly as I reached for the chalk. For just a moment, the edge of a bruise peeked out from under the fabric, dark against my pale skin. I quickly tugged the sleeve down, but not before I caught Mrs. Patterson's sharp intake of breath. Her eyes met mine across the classroom, and I saw something there that I'd never seen before: concern that looked like it might actually lead to action. The final bell rang like a reprieve, but I knew it was really a countdown to another evening of walking on eggshells. I gathered my books slowly, hoping to delay the inevitable walk home. Mrs. Patterson was erasing the blackboard when she called my name softly. "Lauren, could you stay for just a moment? I'd like to talk to you about your math homework." My heart hammered against my ribs as the other students filed out, their voices fading into the hallway. I approached her desk like I was walking toward a cliff, knowing that whatever happened next would change everything. The afternoon sunlight streaming through the classroom windows felt too bright, too revealing, too honest for the conversation I knew was coming. "How are things at home, sweetie?" Mrs. Patterson asked, her voice gentle but firm. The question hung in the air between us like a bridge I was too afraid to cross. I opened my mouth to give her the standard answer: "Fine, everything's fine, we're a normal family." But the words wouldn't come. Instead, I stood there trembling, my books clutched against my chest like armor that couldn't protect me from the truth. She waited patiently, not pushing, just creating space for honesty in a world where I'd learned that truth was dangerous. The clock on the wall ticked loudly in the silence, marking the seconds until I would have to choose between the lie that kept me safe and the truth that might save me. I wanted to tell her everything, about the bruises, about the silence, about the way my mother's love came with conditions I could never meet. I wanted to describe the sound of Joseph's belt cutting through the air, the weight of secrets that made my shoulders ache, the way I practiced being invisible until I almost disappeared completely. But the words felt too big, too dangerous, too real to speak out loud. "I'm fine," I whispered finally, the lie tasting bitter on my tongue. Mrs. Patterson's eyes filled with something that looked like sadness, mixed with determination. "Lauren," she said quietly, "if you ever need someone to talk to, I'm here. And there are people whose job it is to help children who are hurting." The word hurting hung between us like a confession I wasn't ready to make. The next few days passed in a blur of careful movements and calculated silence. I became hyper-aware of every inch of my body, constantly adjusting my sleeves and checking my reflection in bathroom mirrors to ensure no evidence showed. Mrs. Patterson's words echoed in my mind like a song I couldn't stop humming. There are people whose job it is to help children who are hurting. The idea seemed impossible, like believing in fairy tales or magic. In my world, adults were the source of pain, not the solution to it. Joseph's anger had been particularly volatile since he'd lost money gambling over the weekend, and my mother's coldness had reached Arctic temperatures. I moved through our house like a ghost, trying to anticipate their moods and avoid the landmines of their frustration. Wednesday morning brought an unexpected warmth to Billings, and Mrs. Patterson announced that we'd be having outdoor reading time. The thought of sitting in the sunshine with a book felt like a small miracle, but I hesitated when she suggested we could roll up our sleeves to stay cool. Panic fluttered in my chest like a trapped bird as I watched my classmates eagerly push up their sleeves and settle onto the grass. I kept my arms covered, claiming I was cold despite the sweat beading on my forehead. Mrs. Patterson's eyes found mine across the circle of students, and I saw that familiar look of concern deepen. She was watching me more carefully now, and that attention felt both terrifying and strangely comforting. During lunch, I dropped my apple and bent to retrieve it from under the table. As I straightened up, my sleeve caught on the edge of my chair and rode up past my elbow, exposing the constellation of bruises that decorated my forearm like a map of my father's anger. Time seemed to freeze as I realized what had happened, my eyes darting around to see who might have noticed. Sarah Martinez gasped audibly, her hand flying to cover her mouth. "Lauren, what happened to your arm?" she asked, her voice high with shock. I yanked my sleeve down so hard I heard the fabric tear, mumbling something about falling off my bike. But the damage was done. The secret was leaking out like water through a cracked dam. The afternoon crawled by with agonizing slowness. I could feel eyes on me from every direction, whispers following me down the hallways like shadows. Mrs. Patterson called me to her desk during silent reading time, her face serious but kind. "Lauren, I need you to know that what I saw today concerns me very much," she said quietly, her words careful and measured. "Those marks on your arm don't look like they came from falling off a bike." My throat closed completely, and I felt like I was drowning in air. She continued gently, "I'm going to need to make some phone calls, sweetheart. There are people who can help you, but first they need to know what's happening." The word help sounded foreign in my ears, like she was speaking a language I'd never learned. The walk home felt different that day, charged with an electricity that made my skin crawl. I knew that Mrs. Patterson's phone calls would set something in motion that I couldn't stop or control. The familiar dread in my stomach had transformed into something sharper, more urgent. Our house looked the same from the outside. White siding, brown shutters, a small front porch where my mother's wilted flowers struggled to survive in their plastic pots. But I knew that everything was about to change, and change in my family always meant more pain. Joseph's truck was already in the driveway, which meant he'd come home early from work. That was never a good sign. I slipped through the front door as quietly as possible, hoping to make it to my room without being noticed. But Joseph's voice boomed from the kitchen before I'd taken 3 steps. "Lauren, get in here, now!" The tone in his voice was different, not just angry, but suspicious, like he already knew something was wrong. My legs felt like lead as I walked toward the kitchen, each step bringing me closer to whatever storm was waiting. My mother stood at the stove, her back rigid with tension, stirring something that smelled like burnt onions. She didn't turn around when I entered, but I could see her shoulders shaking slightly. The air in the room felt thick and dangerous, like the moments before lightning strikes. "Sit down," Joseph commanded, pointing to the chair across from him at our small kitchen table. His eyes were bloodshot and mean, and I could smell the alcohol on his breath, even from several feet away. "Your teacher called the school office today. Seems she's got some concerns about you." The words hit me like physical blows, and I felt the blood drain from my face. My mother finally turned around, her expression a mixture of fear and fury that I'd seen too many times before. "What did you tell her?" she hissed, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "What lies did you spread about this family?" I opened my mouth to explain, to apologize, to somehow make this better, but no sound came out. The silence stretched between us like a taut wire ready to snap. Joseph's hand slowly curled into a fist on the table, and I watched his knuckles turn white with the effort of restraining himself. "Answer your mother," he said, his voice deadly quiet. "What exactly did you tell that teacher about what goes on in this house?" The question hung in the air like a threat, and I realized that this moment would define everything that came next. I could lie, deny everything, and try to convince them that Mrs. Patterson was mistaken. Or I could finally tell the truth and face whatever consequences came with it. My heart pounded so hard I was sure they could hear it, and for the first time in my life, I felt the dangerous stirring of something that might have been courage. "I didn't tell her anything," I whispered, the lie scraping against my throat like sandpaper. But even as the words left my mouth, I knew they wouldn't be enough to save me. Joseph's eyes narrowed to slits, and I could see the calculation behind them. He was deciding how much pain this betrayal deserved. My mother slammed the wooden spoon down on the counter so hard it cracked, the sound echoing through the kitchen like a gunshot. "Don't you dare lie to us," she snarled, her face twisted with a rage that made her almost unrecognizable. "Teachers don't just call schools about nothing. You must have said something, done something to make her suspicious." The accusation hung between us like poison, and I felt my carefully constructed world beginning to crumble around me. Joseph stood up slowly, his chair scraping against the linoleum floor with a sound that made my teeth ache. He was a big man, made bigger by anger and alcohol, and in that moment he seemed to fill the entire kitchen with his fury. "You know what happens to little girls who can't keep their mouths shut," he said, his voice low and threatening. I did know. I'd learned that lesson over and over again, written in bruises across my skin and carved into my memory with each blow. But something was different this time. Maybe it was Mrs. Patterson's kind eyes, or the way she'd said there were people who could help, but I felt a tiny spark of defiance flicker to life in my chest. It was small and fragile, but it was mine. The first blow came faster than I expected, Joseph's open palm connecting with my cheek with a crack that seemed to echo through the entire house. The force of it sent me tumbling from my chair to the cold kitchen floor, my vision blurring with tears and shock. "That's for embarrassing this family," he growled, standing over me like a mountain of rage. My mother watched from beside the stove, her arms crossed, her face expressionless, except for the slight tightening around her eyes. "Get up," she said coldly. "You're not done yet." I struggled to my feet, my cheek throbbing and my ear ringing, but that spark of defiance still glowed somewhere deep inside me. The beating that followed was worse than usual, fueled by Joseph's fear that his secret was getting out and my mother's fury at being exposed. They took turns, his fists and her words, his belt and her silence, his rage and her cold indifference. But through it all, I held on to Mrs. Patterson's promise that there were people who helped children who were hurting. Each blow reminded me that I was hurting, that this wasn't normal, that I deserved better than this. When it was finally over, I lay curled on the kitchen floor, my body screaming with pain, but my spirit somehow stronger than it had been before. "Clean yourself up," my mother said, stepping over me to reach the refrigerator. "And if you ever embarrass this family again, what happened today will seem like a gentle reminder." I dragged myself to the bathroom, my reflection in the mirror showing damage that couldn't be hidden by long sleeves and careful positioning. My left eye was swelling shut, my lip was split and bleeding, and finger-shaped bruises were already forming on my neck where Joseph had grabbed me. For the first time, I looked at my injuries, not with shame, but with a strange kind of clarity. This was evidence. This was proof. This was the truth that Mrs. Patterson had been trying to help me speak. I touched my swollen face gently, and instead of feeling worthless, I felt something I'd never experienced before, the certainty that what was happening to me was wrong. That night, I lay in my bed listening to my parents argue in hushed, angry voices in the next room. They were scared, I realized. Scared that their secret was out. Scared that someone was watching. Scared that their carefully constructed facade was cracking. "We need to keep her home tomorrow," my mother was saying, "until the bruises fade. Tell the school she's sick." But I knew that keeping me home wouldn't solve their problem. Mrs. Patterson had already seen too much, already made her phone calls, already set something in motion that couldn't be stopped. The thought should have terrified me, but instead it filled me with something that felt dangerously close to hope. Sleep came in fragments, broken by pain and the sound of my own heartbeat thundering in my ears. I dreamed of lighthouses again, but this time I wasn't reading about them. I was standing in one, surrounded by light that cut through the darkness and showed the world exactly what it was. When I woke up, sunlight was streaming through my bedroom window and I could hear my mother on the phone in the kitchen, her voice tight with false concern as she called the school to report my illness. But I knew that today would be different. Today, the truth would finally have a voice, and that voice would be mine. The morning brought a knock at our front door that made my parents freeze like deer caught in headlights. Through my bedroom window, I could see a white car parked in our driveway with official-looking plates and a woman in a business suit standing on our porch with a clipboard. My mother's voice was high and strained as she answered the door, and I could hear her explaining that I was too sick to see anyone today. But the woman's voice was calm and persistent, and I caught fragments of words that made my heart race. Welfare check, concerned teacher, need to see the child. The moment I'd been both dreading and hoping for had finally arrived, and there was no going back now. The woman at our door introduced herself as Ms. Rodriguez from Child Protective Services, and her presence transformed our house from a prison into a crime scene. My mother's performance was Oscar-worthy. The concerned parent worried about her sick daughter, the confusion about why anyone would think something was wrong, the invitation for Ms. Rodriguez to see for herself that everything was fine. But I could see the panic behind her eyes, the way her hands trembled as she smoothed down her hair and adjusted her clothes. Joseph had disappeared into the garage, claiming he had work to do, but I knew he was hiding like the coward he really was. When Ms. Rodriguez asked to see me, my mother's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing the terror underneath. "She's sleeping," my mother said quickly. "The fever broke this morning, but she's still very weak." Ms. Rodriguez wasn't buying it. She had the kind of eyes that had seen too much to be fooled by amateur acting, and she moved through our house with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what she was looking for. "I understand your concern for Lauren's health," she said politely but firmly, "but I need to speak with her directly. It's standard procedure." My mother led her down the hallway toward my room, her footsteps heavy with dread. I heard the soft knock on my door, followed by Ms. Rodriguez's gentle voice, asking if she could come in. When I opened the door, I saw her face change as she took in my swollen eye, split lip, and the bruises that no amount of makeup could have hidden. "Hello, Lauren," she said softly. "My name is Maria Rodriguez, and I'm here because your teacher is worried about you." The conversation that followed felt like stepping into sunlight after years in a cave. Ms. Rodriguez asked me questions that no adult had ever asked before. Not about what I'd done wrong, but about what had been done to me. She photographed my injuries with a camera that clicked softly in the quiet of my bedroom, each flash capturing evidence of a truth I'd carried alone for so long. When she asked me to tell her what happened, the words came pouring out like water through a broken dam. I told her about Joseph's fists and belt, about my mother's cold indifference, about the years of walking on eggshells and learning to be invisible. With each word, I felt lighter, as if the weight of secrets was finally lifting from my shoulders. Ms. Rodriguez listened without judgment, taking notes and nodding encouragingly, treating my story like it mattered. The next few hours passed in a whirlwind of phone calls, official forms, and hushed conversations between adults who suddenly cared very much about my well-being. My mother alternated between rage and desperate attempts at damage control, insisting that I was lying, that I was a troubled child who made up stories for attention. But the evidence was written across my body in languages that couldn't be denied or explained away. Joseph was questioned by police officers who arrived with Ms. Rodriguez's second visit, his bluster and intimidation tactics useless against people who weren't afraid of him. I watched from my bedroom window as he was led away in handcuffs, his shoulders slumped in defeat. For the first time in my life, I saw him as what he really was, not a giant to be feared, but a broken man who hurt children because he could. As the sun set on that day that changed everything, I found myself sitting in Ms. Rodriguez's car with a small suitcase containing everything I owned. My mother stood in the doorway of our house, her face a mask of fury and betrayal, watching as I was driven away from the only life I'd ever known. But instead of fear, I felt something I'd never experienced before, the possibility of safety, of being valued, of living without constant terror. Ms. Rodriguez explained that I would be staying with a foster family who specialized in helping children who had been hurt, people who understood that healing took time and patience. "You're very brave, Lauren," she said, as we drove through the streets of Billings toward an uncertain but hopeful future. Speaking up took more courage than most adults ever have to find. As the familiar landmarks of my childhood disappeared behind us, I realized that for the first time in my life, I was moving towards something better instead of running from something worse.